The Russians are serious. They could really invade, and we need to be protected.
What do you think of the situation in Ukraine right now?
Unprecedented levels of Russian aggression.
Do you see trends that might be leading toward authoritarianism?
It is something that all Americans should pay attention to.
You're talking about mind reading.
This is so often talked about as these are Chinese capabilities. I think it's important to remember that once the technology exists, it could be used by others.
How long does it take to go, wait a minute, our government is this is not a democracy anymore? Autocracies, in authoritarian regimes, they seem to work together in some ways, but I always found that kind of weird because they're not aligned ideologically, right? It's not like fundamentalist Islamic regime of Iran. They don't really have a ton in common with Venezuela, unless I'm missing something. But yet these are allies somehow.
Yeah, this was actually one of the original insights that led me to write the book. As I said, I spent a lot of years writing about the Soviet bloc and Soviet history. And back in the 20th century, there was a thing called the Soviet bloc, and they shared an ideology and they had similar principles, at least in theory. They even had similar symbols on their flags and so on. What we now have in the world is an alliance, but it's not really an alliance. It's really a network of autocratic states who don't have ideology in common, who are left-wing and right-wing, who some of them are one-man regimes, some of them are run by single ruling parties. They include communist China, nationalist Russia, as you said, theocratic Iran, Bolivarian socialist Venezuela, North Korea, Belarus, Zimbabwe. I mean, these are countries that don't have a single set of ideas. They do have some things in common. All of them are regimes who seek to rule without checks and balances, without legitimate democratic opposition, without any real opposition, without independent courts, without the rule of law. So they're countries that are run, it's called rule by law, meaning the law is what the regime says it is at any given moment. It doesn't have any separate status. And they all seek to they try to rule without independent media or conversation. And that links them. They're also linked by a kind of set of opportunistic interests. They have financial interests in common. The quasi-state, quasi-private companies in one country invest in the quasi-state, quasi-private companies of another. That brings them together. They sell one another surveillance technology, other kinds of technology. The Chinese sell actually surveillance technology to a lot of these countries. They also see one another as allies in a kind of ill-defined global struggle that most of us aren't even aware of. In other words, they will come to one another's rescue. So you mentioned Venezuela. So Venezuela is a country that is a failed state. It was the wealthiest country in South America. It's now the poorest. It produces more, depending on how you calculate, more refugees than Ukraine, even though it's not at war. Its economy has collapsed. It has no legitimacy. Actually, the regime just lost an election, and the opposition proved that they lost an election. They had the papers and the documents and the data to prove it. Nevertheless, Maduro, who's now the dictator, stays in power. How does he do that? One of the most important ways is that he has military support from Russia. He has investment from China. He has help with his security services from Cuba. He has, and as he said, he has this weird relationship with Iran. Why do Iran, left-wing socialist Venezuela, and Islamic Republic of Iran, why do they work together? Well, they're both oil states. They're both under sanctions. They help one another evade sanctions. The Venezuelans have lent visas, we think, to Hezbollah activists so that they can travel freely. They see themselves as united essentially against us. And by us, I mean very broadly the democratic world, the world where, at least in theory, we believe in the rule of law and accountability and transparency. And they help one another stay in power, working against us. And they see at least the ideas that we represent as their biggest threat. So the language of accountability, the language of rights, the language of justice, all that language, which is, of course, in dispute in every country on the planet, but all that language is what they see. It's the language of their own oppositions. It's the language of the Venezuelan opposition. The Russian opposition used the language of anti-corruption. The Iranian opposition the women's movement in Iran uses the language of rights. They see that language as their biggest threat to their form of autocracy. And that's the fundamental thing that they have in common.
It's almost like you kind of mentioned a network. It almost sounds like corporations that happen to work together on something as opposed to nations that work together.
Yeah, this is exactly the metaphor that I wanted. It's as if there were a conglomerate of companies and each one of them had their own business model, but they cooperate where it suits them. So where a moment of trade suits them, or where they see a common interest or something that they can do together, they work together.
Yeah, they help each other, I suppose, have their intelligence services travel around, launder money and stuff. I mean, you see this with BRICS, right? One of the funny things that I see online a lot is like, oh, the U.S. dollar's going down, BRICS is getting stronger, and then you talk to somebody who is like deep, in a PhD economist or something like that that's worked for a large international organization. They're like, BRICS? You mean the countries that can't even get along or agree on one single thing and have no reason to trust each other are all suddenly going to band together and create a non-dollar international currency when they won't even float their own currencies on the international market? Sure thing, buddy.
Yeah, I mean, BRICS doesn't overlap exactly with Autocracy Inc. And so let me complicate further. So there are the real autocratic states. There's also a large group of states in the middle. And here I would put India. I would put the Emirates, I would put Turkey, who are, they're illiberal states. Some of them still have elections. Some of them have some freedoms, sometimes which are more hybrid. They're willing to work both with the democratic world and the autocratic world. Of course, many democracies work with the autocratic world too. So it's not as if it's not the Cold War. It's not as if there's a Berlin Wall and there are good guys on one side and there are bad guys on the other, and there are clear lines between them. And BRICS includes, just by including Brazil, by including India, by including South Africa, those are states that are hybrid. I mean, actually, Brazil's a democracy. So those are states with a different set of interests from Russia and China and Iran.
Yeah, I guess I should have been clear. I don't mean that the BRICS countries are an axis of evil per se. I just thought I brought it up as an idea that these countries work together when it sort of suits them, but it's not. These alliances, almost by definition, can't be as strong. My outside opinion can't be as strong as, say, an alliance between the United States and Australia or the UK, for example, because if the only thing you have in common is, man, it sure is hard to make money when we're under sanctions, man, those Americans are really getting under our skin economically, that's sort of a weaker tie than we share hundreds of years of common values of language and culture.
You've just hit on a really, really important point about alliances. So one of the things that makes the United States different from other large superpowers on the planet is that we have had for many decades these values-based alliances that are based on long-term relationships, trading relationships, cultural relationships, ties of, military ties, but also, personal ties. And that's the U.S., Europe, Australia, Japan, South Korea, these are countries that have worked together in ways that are deeper than mere opportunism. And they've understood those relationships for a long time as being kind of win-win relationships. They're not zero sum. It's not like one person wins, one person loses. And you're right. Unlike the relationships of the autocratic world, they're not merely opportunistic. They're not simply to achieve, a business deal. They're meant to be long-term, and they're meant to last a long time. And they are, of course, right now under threat. And if you want to go in that direction, we can talk about why.
Yeah, we can get there in a little bit. I do have, and look, I'm 45 years old and I'm not a historian, so you might have to explain some relatively simple things to me. But I remember I grew up in the 80s, right, in the Cold War, and it's the Soviet Union, the main autocracy of that time, at least kind of pretended to care about norms and international order. When I look at these old videos, or because I wanted to see what the foreign ministers of the Soviet Union were saying about things just like they do now, where they sort of pretend to care about the international order when the United States does something, but then when they do something like, oh, it's our own affair, don't get involved, right? Ukraine is a domestic affair, or whatever. They pretended they cared about the superiority of, say, Soviet communism. This system is superior. Everyone look at how well we're doing. Now it's like they just don't give a crap. You have the dictator of Belarus, or Putin for that matter. They just flout any semblance of order, of rule of law, or like we follow this specific system. It's just all kind of like the mask is off and they're like, okay, that failed. We don't need to replace it. We can still do whatever we want. Try and stop me. That's kind of what I see from them now.
This is right. This is one of the things I document in the book. So yes, the Soviet Union did seek to appear to be an international law abiding state. And it took seriously criticisms of the Soviet Union at the UN. I mean, I don't know if this is actually before both of our time, but there's a famous scene at the UN, many decades ago when Khrushchev, who was then the leader of the Soviet Union, famously was supposed to have banged his shoe on the table. Okay.
I heard about this.
And the reason why which by the way, it's not clear whether it really happened, but it's one of those things that's too good to check. But he supposedly banged his shoe on the table. And the reason he did it was because another delegate, if memory serves, it was someone from the Philippines, but I could be wrong, had accused him of violating the rights of people in Central Europe, and that's outrageous. We would never do that. And so what he was objecting to was a criticism of that the Soviet Union was defying the law or depriving people of rights. So you are right that what we're seeing now, and this began with Russia, actually, is a group of states who no longer even pretend that they are conforming to international law. In fact, one of the primary reasons, I believe, for the invasion of Ukraine, for the Russian invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago, and we're almost at the anniversary, 3 years ago, was because, obviously it was part of the reason was Putin wants a new Russian empire. Part of the reason was he wanted to show that he would crush democracy in Ukraine to discourage any Russians from wanting to take that route. But he also wanted to say, look, I can do this. Like, I can invade Ukraine. I can bomb civilians. I can kidnap children. He's kidnapped 20,000 children, taken them from Ukraine, occupied Ukraine to Russia. I can torture people. I can defy the Geneva Conventions, the UN Charter, the UN, all kinds of institutional language on human rights. I can do all of this, and you can't stop me. So what he's trying to show is that he doesn't care about any of these documents or any of these laws or rules or norms from the 20th century and from the early part of the 21st century. And they are seeking really to create a different kind of world. And Putin uses this word multipolarity, which actually, just on the face of it is a neutral word. Multipolarity means that there are lots of powers and who have a lot of nations who have power, and that's obviously true. So multipolarity exists. It's real. But he's using it in a very specific way. He's talking about multipolarity replacing what he calls hegemony. And by hegemony, he means a world in which those kinds of laws and language, the language of rights, the language of borders, the language of the rule of law, is abolished in favor of essentially a world in which very big countries get to decide what they want and little countries don't have sovereignty. And if Russia wants to invade Ukraine, Russia gets to do that and nobody can stop them. And so that's the world they're seeking to create, and those are the institutions they want to destroy. And of course, it's very dangerous because there have been many. I don't want to claim that the last 70 or 80 years have been perfect by any means, but the fact that the U.S., Europe, so many other countries have been able to invest so much in welfare, in scientific research, in increasing the prosperity of their nations, as opposed to spending, 20 or 30 or 40% of their national budgets on the military. This has been the blessing of the post-war world. This is one of the reasons we've had so much prosperity. If we return to a world in which might makes right and everybody needs a huge army, then we're going to be living on a very different kind of planet. But that is what the Russians want. And increasingly, it seems that it may even be what the Chinese want.
It seems like it, but it also, some critics might say that's what the U.S. wants. They're forcing NATO spending to be higher in these other countries as well. So what would you say to somebody who says, well, hey, you say these countries work together, U.S. and their allies work together, NATO, for example. I mean, somebody might just point out that counterexample. I know it's different, but maybe you can articulate how.
Sure. So NATO is a defensive alliance. NATO, it was created to react to attacks on its members. And that has been its role, since it was created, decades ago. NATO doesn't invade other countries. NATO doesn't, it doesn't have plans to do so, and it doesn't talk about doing so. NATO has increased its military. NATO actually, after the end of the Cold War, reduced its military spending dramatically. And there was one moment in which there were no U.S. tanks in Europe. So the U.S. withdrew enormous forces from Europe. The Europeans reduced their armies. NATO almost began to dissolve. I mean, if you look at kind of the late 90s, early 2000s, a lot of conversations. You can go back and read the op-eds. People were saying, do we still need NATO and so on? But it existed as a kind of shell just in case. I mean, the return of NATO spending and the return of, actually the expansion of NATO, because Sweden and Finland have recently joined NATO, is happening because of the perception of Russian threat. So as the Russians began to change their posture, as the Russians began to say, began to express an interest in aggression, in invading other countries, invading Ukraine, they invaded Georgia, they threatened Estonia, they've threatened, they threatened everybody. They've threatened the British, they've threatened the Poles, they've threatened the Germans. As they began to do that in a more regular and a more believable way, everybody began to say, right, we need to think once again about self-defense. And of course, the invasion of Ukraine was a triggering point where people saw that Putin was prepared for a very large-scale war. And he was prepared for civilian atrocities, for the destruction of infrastructure, all of those things. And that meant that NATO needed to refresh its defenses. And that process is continuing, actually. I mean, the European countries are now almost all spending more than 2%. Some of them are higher than that. Poland, where I lived part of the time, is over 4% of its GDP. I mean, I'm talking about percentages of GDP on the military. And in a way, it's very sad. I mean, that's money that people aren't spending on healthcare or, building nice parks and cities. I mean, there are a lot of things that you sacrifice for doing that, but that's all happening because of this perception of threat. So NATO was, NATO has been an institution that was interested in keeping the rules. I mean, NATO was very Europe focused. So, the idea of NATO was that it was part of a set of European institutions that would preserve borders in Europe, that would prevent the repeat of a large scale war of the kind that everybody suffered from in the 1940s. It has never been an institution designed to project power into Russia or anywhere else.
So isn't that one of the chief, I won't say criticisms, but allegations by Putin was that he invaded Ukraine because NATO was expanding? And you're saying,
NATO
it sounds
expanded
like you're saying,
after he invaded Ukraine. He
well,
frightened.
That's for sure true. Yeah.
So Ukraine was not a member of NATO, and
Right.
nor was it on the path to be a member of NATO. And I have to say, even, had Ukraine been a member of NATO, maybe the invasion wouldn't have happened. And so
Right.
one of the reasons the invasion happened was because Ukraine was a country that was in limbo. It didn't have any real military guarantees. It did have, actually, there had been security guarantees signed in the 1990s, this famous Budapest Memorandum signed by the US and the UK and Russia that guaranteed Ukraine's borders and Ukrainian sovereignty. But that obviously was abandoned by Russia in 2014 with the first invasion of Crimea. But Ukraine was not provoking Russia. Ukraine was not seeking to invade Russia. Nobody was invading Russia. Nobody was seeking to provoke Russia. I mean, these were all, again, NATO was a defensive alliance. Ukraine was without protection, and that may have been the mistake.
All right, just a quick break. I'm going to tell you about something that'll actually make your life easier. If you're thinking about starting a business or you already have one and maybe logo or branding design is not your strong suit, you're going to love Design.com. With Design.com, creating a standout logo is as easy as it gets. You just pop in your business name and your industry, and in seconds, you're going to get thousands of custom logos to choose from. Every design is handcrafted by top designers and exclusive to Design.com, so you're getting something unique. Once you find a design that you like, you can customize the fonts, the colors, the layouts to make it yours. Then you download all those assets and you're good to go. And Design.com doesn't just stop at logos. They've got tools to help you create all of your branding materials, from website to social media posts to business cards, all perfectly aligned with your brand. If you already have a logo, you can upload it and you get instant access to thousands of design templates that actually match your brand's look and your color scheme. So this tool saves you a lot of time. It lets you focus on growing your business instead of getting stuck in the weeds with marketing materials. With a 4.8-star Trustpilot rating, Design.com is legit amazing. It's run by a friend of mine. The company's been around for a while. They really do care about their customers. Try it for free at design.com/Jordan. That's design.com/Jordan. Seems like when Putin or whoever says, hey, NATO's expanding towards our borders, they maybe were pointing to what, like Romania or something like that, having joined in the early aughts. I don't really know. I just know that it's a common refrain among people who say, well, the reason Ukraine happened was because NATO was right on Russia's doorstep.
It's a common refrain among people who are repeating Russian propaganda.
Well, yeah, I agree with that. I agree with you. I'm not arguing that. I'm just trying to figure, I'm having you give me some ammo against these people because I see that argument a lot.
Again, I could go, let me go a little bit farther back in history, in that case. As early as the 1990s, Russia, which had become independent after the collapse of the Soviet Union, already in 1993-94 had begun to make threatening gestures towards some of its neighbors. And there's a famous speech that's given by the president of Estonia in 1994, in which he was given in Hamburg, and he spoke about how happy Estonia was to be a member of Europe again, and he talked about architecture and so on. He also talked about, this is 1994, he also talked about the reemergence of a threat from Russia. In other words, he was already then hearing language from Russia threatening Estonian sovereignty, questioning whether Estonia was really an independent nation or not. And there's a famous thing that happened at that speech. Again, it was in Hamburg. There was somebody in the room who was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg who walked out of the speech. And of course, the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, it was Putin at that time. Yeah. So the language of threat that began coming from Russia towards former Russian colonies and towards former Soviet states begins already in the 90s. In 2003, 4, and 5, there begin to be other kinds of threats. There's a big cyber attack on Estonia at that time.
I remember that.
There are specific threats towards, there is a record of Russia threatening its neighbors that goes back 20 years. And so all of those neighbors, the reason NATO expanded, following the Cold War, was because those countries felt under direct threat, and they were not wrong. So if you look at the history, it goes the other way around. So people were clamoring to join NATO. Why did Poland want to join NATO? Why did Romania want to join NATO? Why did Lithuania want to join NATO? They wanted to join NATO because they were already felt under threat from Russia. So, in that same period of time, there were gestures made to Russia. There was a NATO-Russian partnership that was created. Russia was invited to join the G7, which for a while was the G8. Russia was invited to a whole series of other institutions. There was an idea that Russia was, of course, part of the WTO, but there was an idea that Russia would be wrapped into a series of institutions and would, through trade and through interaction, would eventually cease to be hostile, and then maybe, down the road, there was even talk of Russia eventually being in NATO. Okay.
That's crazy, isn't it?
And that now seems crazy, but that was a moment of high optimism. This is also, I write about this a little bit in the book. There was a moment of high optimism in the 90s and 2000s when that felt possible. And so the question that you have to ask is, why didn't it happen? And why did the Russians reject that path? And why were their neighbors so frightened of them? It wasn't, the U.S. was not the power that wanted to expand NATO. It was coming from those states. They wanted protection. They wanted to be part of Western clubs. They wanted to integrate with Europe, and they were afraid of Russia. And they've been afraid of Russia since the 90s. So it's not new. I mean, people who don't know the history of NATO expansion and who don't understand the sequence of events and why it happened, are accepting a Russian narrative about why it happened. It did not happen because those states were aggressive towards Russia. It happened because they were afraid of Russia. The other thing you need to know is that until 2014, there were no U.S. troops and very few NATO facilities of any kind in Eastern Europe. So there was no expansion, there was no movement of troops, into Poland. I mean, none of that happened until the invasion of Crimea, which really scared people for the first time. And people said, right, the Russians are serious. They could really invade, and we need to be protected, and we need to.
Jeez.
But even then, I mean, a lot of it was pretty superficial. I mean, up until 2022, when the second full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, there was still pretty scarce NATO facilities in Eastern Europe. I mean, that is now beginning to change. And I mean, you've now had a big military buildup in several of the eastern states, including Poland, but also others. But that is coming because people are afraid of Russia. They are afraid of being invaded. They're afraid of their own cities being destroyed. Some are under economic pressure from Russia. Some of the other tactics that I described in the book, I mean, there's big Russian propaganda campaigns all over Europe. There's a Russian sabotage campaign in Europe now. There have been warehouses and even shopping malls and other kinds of objects have been there have been arson attacks and bombs. So people are now perceive that Russia is looking for ways to put political and economic and eventually maybe military pressure on Europe. And so Europeans are gearing up to defend themselves. Is it what people wanted? It is not. Is it popular in every country? It is not. Do Europeans want to pay for armies? No, they don't. No, nobody wants to pay for an army. As I said, they want to pay for healthcare and parks.
Yeah.
But this is coming from a really profound shift in Russia that's taken place over the last 20 years, and an unprecedented levels of Russian aggression.
I hadn't planned on going in this direction in the show, but I'm curious, and you can tell me if this is like, hey, I don't feel like talking about this. What do you think of the situation in Ukraine right now, the peace plan to basically just, I mean, it sounds like capitulate to Putin and cut the country in half. I also, do we think that that's the best way to end hostilities, or do we think that's just going to give Russia time to regroup and attack Ukraine again?
So there isn't a peace plan in Ukraine. I mean, this is,
the Twitter peace plan.
There is no Twitter peace plan. There is no peace plan. So this is one of this very weird phenomenon, which might even be described as, experts talking to themselves. This war will be over when the Russians no longer believe they can win. In other words, the war will end when the Russians can't fight anymore or don't want to fight anymore. And so far, at least on this, at this moment as we're speaking, in February 2025, I don't see any evidence that the Russians want to stop fighting. So everybody who says there's a peace plan, and that includes, there was a fake one that was going around recently. I mean, there have been several.
That's probably the one I saw.
Everyone who thinks there's a peace plan as I said, they're speaking to other people. They're not speaking to Putin himself. I mean, maybe this could change, in the coming days and weeks. But right now, I haven't seen evidence that Putin has changed his goal. So Putin's goal is to destroy all of Ukraine, to put a pro-Russian government in Kiev, and to remove Ukrainian sovereignty. That's why he's fighting the war. And as I said, I spoke already about what some of the reasons are. One of the but that's his goal. He has not verbally or in any other way given up that goal. So the issue with creating a ceasefire is not persuading Ukraine to have a ceasefire. The Ukrainians would have a ceasefire, and we could put pressure on them to have a ceasefire, and that's not. But to have a ceasefire, you need two countries. Both sides have to stop fighting. And as of right this second, I don't see that Russia's ready to stop fighting. So I am a little mystified by what everybody thinks is the plan, because right now there isn't one. I mean, if we were to get to a ceasefire for whatever reason, Putin wants a break or something, then we are in another, wherever they draw the line, then we would be in another danger zone, which is that a ceasefire that did not emerge from Putin deciding that he couldn't win the war would be in danger of falling apart, 1 month or 2 years down the line when Putin decides to renew the war. So the war is really only over when the Russians acknowledge that Ukraine is an independent state and that it deserves its own sovereignty. And then we end the war. And then we can argue about where the border will be. So that is actually when you hear whatever happens over the next few months, when you hear this discussed, just remember that the question is not where the line is drawn or, how we do peacekeeping. The question is, have the Russians given up on their most important goal? And so are they stopping because they need a pause? They're losing an extraordinary number of people right now. I mean, just thousands and thousands and thousands of people every month. And it's something like, I saw a statistic actually just today, where it's between the proportion of Russians dying to Ukrainians dying is either 1 to 7 or 1 to 10, depending on whose numbers you're using. So 7 Russians die for every Ukrainian. So they're throwing fantastic numbers of people, and they're and they're dying. And I've also seen recently, the Ukrainians keep track of how many objects they hit. They have a way of keeping track of, and they keep video, to prove it. There are sort of video tracking of what they hit. And the Ukrainians are hitting every month, again, thousands of Russian pieces of equipment, radar, troops. I mean, they are hitting enormous numbers of people and goods. So the Russians are losing an enormous number of people and equipment, and they won't be able to keep it up indefinitely. And what they are hoping is that support from Ukraine will somehow disappear or dissolve. That's what they were hoping they would get from the election of Trump. They may still get it. I don't know. We're not at that stage yet. We don't have a resolution. But essentially, until at some point they will give up. But if that hasn't happened, then the war isn't over.
I've heard that it's dangerous, even if Putin did want to end the war, let's say this week, that he would have trouble doing so, not just because he would look really bad having not achieved his goal, but also, and I don't know how much you know about this, but the entire economy of Russia at this point is on a wartime footing. So if you just go, all right, we don't need radar, tanks, guns, ammunition, it's kind of like saying, all right, no tech companies in California. And it's like, well, that's kind of a big number of jobs and GDP that we're just turning off with the flip of a switch. So it's almost like they can't afford to stop the war at this point. It's not something you can grind to a halt overnight without causing massive damage. Yeah,
that's correct. I mean, they've restructured their economy, which is now focused on producing military equipment. Of course, that has traps, as we know from American history and from the history of other countries. I mean, if you're spending an enormous amount of money to produce military equipment, I mean, if you produce a car, then it exists for 20 years. If you produce a tank, it's a kind of dead end product. I mean, it only has one use. It goes to the war, it's blown up, and that's it. And there's a limit to how long Russia will be able to simply pump the money it earns from oil and gas into tanks and guns, and maintain the rest of the economy and maintain some level of prosperity for people. I mean, this is actually how the Soviet Union fell apart. So this is a story that we know. Eventually, they spent so much money, such a high proportion of money on the military that they impoverished their people, and that led to, eventually, I mean, it was more complicated than that, but that eventually led to the end of the system. So it's not something they can do indefinitely.
This is a unrelated sort of tangent here, but why do autocratic states spend so much time disparaging the West? What does it do? I noticed that there's almost like it's not a part-time job. It's several people's full-time job to think of reasons why the West sucks. I see it from China a lot, and I see it from Russia a lot. I see it from other places and alliances a lot. I see it from people who pretend to be Americans a lot online as well, or Europeans. And some real Americans
who are actually Americans.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah. What is the function of this?
So this is because the language of democracy, which is language that quite a lot of Americans also now disparage, the language of the rule of law, the language of, independent courts, transparency, accountability. This language is the thing that threatens them the most. So they are, what is Putin most afraid of? What's the movement he worries about the most? What he worries about the most is what he saw happen in Ukraine in 2014, which was a mass uprising that was focused on anti-corruption. So young people saying, we don't want corrupt leaders anymore. We want the rule of law. That was actually what that moment was about. This is the 2014 Maidan, so-called Maidan revolution. That language and those movements is the one thing that threatens them ideologically. So, and the same is true in China. What was the biggest threat to Chinese stability in the last, several years? It was the Hong Kong democracy movement, which also used that language. The Chinese actually came to this conclusion a long time ago. There's the document that I cite in my book, dating from 2013, which has a marvelous name. It was written by the, ideologues at the Chinese Communist Party, and it's called Document Number 9. Very evocative. And the document famously describes a set of perils to the Chinese Communist Party. Like, what are the things that are most dangerous to the Chinese Communist Party? And number one was Western constitutional democracy. So the idea of Western constitutions, the idea that people should have choice, the idea that people should have rights, the idea that there should be a legal system that's separate from the will of the Chinese Communist Party. This is the thing that the Chinese Communist Party decided was most threatening to their form of government. So they see there is actually a war of ideas going on. We may not know it. We might not care about it. We don't probably wake up in the morning, most of us, thinking about the Chinese Communist Party, but at least some people in the Chinese Communist Party, they wake up every morning thinking about us because they perceive us as a threat to them. And that's why they've gone to extraordinary lengths. They've gone to, they produce huge propaganda campaigns, as you've noted, designed to smear the West, smear democracy, smear Americans. They've looked for allies in the Western world, political parties, political leaders, propagandists, newspaper columnists who will join them in this smearing of and attacking of the West and of American and European democracy. The Chinese have invested, hundreds of millions, if not more, in networks of television, radio, newspaper, media all over Africa, Latin America. They use those networks partly to put out this, language that criticizes roughly speaking, our values. This is something they consider to be extremely important, and it's one of the sources of their feelings of competitiveness with us. They think that their systems are incompatible with ours. As I said, we don't think about it much, and there was a period in the 90s and 2000s when I think we hoped that we would all eventually be compatible, that we could trade on the basis of, win-win for everybody. If everybody's making money, then why not keep going? And that was, I think, also, to be fair, that was what they believed at the time. You can find Chinese and Russian writers and politicians in that period saying exactly the same thing. But for a variety of reasons, this idea has fallen apart, and they don't believe that anymore. They believe that they are in a war of ideas against us, and they need to win.
So a critic might say, come on now, we spend a ton of time disparaging China, Russia, North Korea. How is this different?
It's not. We are not all of us, but some Western politicians. Sorry, I don't like to use the word Western anymore, but democratic world politicians, understand both the economic challenge and the ideological threat that comes from the autocratic world, and they have invested also in seeking to fight back, to fight their ideas and to fight their language, and to fight the autocratic narrative. this is a pretty sophisticated battle. So there is something like an autocratic narrative that the autocratic world has been building for a long time, and you'll recognize it. And it's the idea that autocracies are stable and safe, and democracies are weak and divided, and autocracies defend traditional values, and democracies are degenerate. They've worked on that, and they've built it, and there are people on the other side of the world, in the democratic world, who have tried to fight back by arguing that democracy is better and so on. So yeah, we are. I don't think we're as engaged. We haven't invested the kind of money. We are right now, as we're having this conversation, we're beginning to dismantle some of the institutions that have been used to fight that battle. USAID, for example, the American aid agency that's being dismantled this week, was one of them. So maybe we're not going to continue fighting it, but yeah, we have been fighting it for a long time, and I think we should have been doing it more.
Yeah, it's that. This is one of the things that keeps me up at night. Is I know USAID trained a lot of journalists from, say, Belarus who write for Belarusian people outside of Belarus, and they're one of the only sources of actual free information in Russian, for example, that these people can get. And now they're like, what am I gonna do? Take cryptocurrency donations from? Who's going to fund this? And so that makes me quite nervous. One thing I never quite understood, and I don't want to get too deep into the weeds on this, but how you mentioned document 9, number one thing that the Chinese Communist Party was afraid of was Western democratic constitutional democracy. How can communists who are supposedly building a workers' paradise by and for the people also find that the biggest threat to them is democracy? Isn't that governance by the people? How is that not a part of this whole idea?
So it's even weirder than that. So the Chinese would describe themselves as the real Democrats. And you can actually find documents where Putin and Xi describe themselves as the true Democrats. So the word democracy has a lot of begins to lose its meaning over time, in a lot of these conversations. But the Chinese Communist Party's argument would be that the desire and will and beliefs of the Chinese people are expressed through the party. Their idea of how the people express themselves is different, and it's not expressed through elections. It's not expressed through competition. It's not expressed through through rights or through for citizens taking action. It's expressed by the greater knowledge of the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, that's an autocratic way of thinking, that the people don't participate through activism or voting or anything else. Instead, they are represented by their leaders, and the leaders wisely take the decisions on their behalf and in their favor. And that is the essential argument for autocracy, whether it's in China or Russia, or anywhere else.
It reminds me, North Korea has a clunky version of this where if you ask them why Kim Jong-un, for example, is the best person to lead the country, they basically get into the supernatural elements of his powers immediately. Whereas if you ask somebody who's an educated Chinese person why the CCP or Xi Jinping is the best person to run the country, they don't say... They know better than to be like, well, he can fly on a winged unicorn. But it's the arguments that it seems like they're making are kind of that same thing. Like, don't you want to know what the people want so that will of the people gets expressed? No, actually, we just have this. And then it's like word salad about how the CCP somehow can sublimate the will of the people, and you don't need elections or any sort of input from them on this. It's just... like, it doesn't actually make any freaking sense.
No. So there's always an element of magic. I mean, and
literal magic.
Literal magic. So I am the expression. I mean, I am the expression of the will of the people, or I alone can fix it from our own history, recent history. I remember reading a speech that Trotsky gave. Okay, this is very down in the weeds and very long time ago. And, before crowds, and he would talk in exactly this way, like, I speak for you. I am representing you. Whenever you hear a leader talk like that, when he says, I am your voice, or I am your, that's actually a moment where you should worry. because leaders are not meant to have a magic ability to feel and embody and be the nation. Leaders are meant to, make rational choices based on evidence, and they're meant to consult with, other politicians, and they're meant to come to consensus. That's how we do it in democracies. We don't have magic.
Yeah, I just kept thinking to myself, what am I missing? Where this isn't just a supernatural power that this person has to essentially claim to have, or this group of people essentially has to claim to have in order to run the country. And the propaganda from these authoritarian regimes, it's often kind of laughable. There was, back during the Syrian civil war, they were trying to promote, or they were saying they were trying to promote tourism. Like, this is a great place to go on vacation. It's like, well, except for the barrel bombs, what are you talking about? And you said something interesting in the book, that often the point of this propaganda is not to make people believe the lie, but to believe in the power of the liar. And going back to the Gulf War, it's like there was I forget what we used to call him, but there was a guy who was a propaganda minister, and he would say, the Americans are nowhere near, it's nice and peaceful here. And you could see the explosions in the background, and they could have not aired that, but they were just like, you know what? We don't care if you believe it. The point is, we're saying it. That's all you need to know.
So this is another way in which you can recognize authoritarians, is the repetitive and constant lying. And as you said, then, and I described this in the book, sometimes it's not even lies designed to hoodwink people. You're not even really meant to believe the liar. Again, you're right. There were great examples from Syria where they would describe Syria as a tourist paradise. There are recent examples from Russia. There are a lot of great old Soviet examples as well. The point is that if you have the power to lie on TV and nobody's contradicting you, then that gives you also an extra kind of magic, and it makes people afraid of you. So the point of lying in public, and constant and repetitive lying that, again, we see in our country, is not just to make people believe something that's not true. It's also to express a form of power.
It's almost like if you just turn the level of cynicism up to 11, people would be too, what's the word? I guess nihilistic to join a freedom movement. Like, hey, look how much power they have. They can tell us the sky is red, and even though don't believe your own lying eyes, believe what I tell you. How can we fight against this? Is that am I on the right track here with the rationale for this?
Well, the way to fight against it is to return as much as possible to reality, and to get people to focus on the real world around them. We're now on a slightly different topic, but we now clearly live in a world in which the online world and the mythologies that can be created online, and I don't just mean social media, I mean whatever, YouTube, TV, and lots of, can be more powerful than what's real. In other words, the stuff that you see when you walk out your door, and encounter on your way to work clearly now seems less real to people than the myths that they absorb through media and social media. And that has given new possibilities to dictators and would-be dictators, or autocrats and would-be autocrats. Because if you can get people to focus on myth instead of reality, then all of that stuff, the magic, the conspiracy theories, the repetitive lies, have a lot more power.
When I used to work at a law firm called Linklaters, which I heard you name check actually in the book. It's funny because I vaguely remember working on projects with Russian law firms, and I think part of the deal you mentioned in the book was Rosneft. Putin run sales of shares for Rosneft. And it just really brought into stark relief how kleptocracy, so essentially robbing of the people, and autocracy not only do those go hand in hand, but Western institutions and professionals like me as a lawyer really are kind of an integral cog in that machine. Lawyers, bankers, I did a show with, I think his name was Oliver Bullough. It's been almost like
he's a
10
friend of
years now
mine.
or something. He's a super interesting guy. And he was telling us how homes in England or very fancy streets would be owned by random shell companies. No one's ever been there except for the cleaning or security person. And occasionally the neighbors will see someone go in, and then you find out when they dig enough, it's owned by like a friend of the Nigerian president. And it's like, well, why? How does an orchestra conductor have $1 billion? What's going on here?
So let me go back. Let me go back a step. So most of us, you probably, and probably most of the people listening to this conversation, live in what I would describe as the normal economy, right? We have a salary, we pay taxes, we keep our money in a bank account. When we sell our shares, whatever, we pay taxes on that. If there are regulations and we have a business, then we abide by regulations. In addition to that world, there is an alternate world in which people don't pay taxes. They keep their money in tax havens. They operate through anonymous shell companies so that nobody can identify who the true owner is. They have been using those anonymous shell companies to buy properties. They buy houses in London. They buy apartments in New York. I'm afraid to say that a pretty large percentage of condos in Trump-owned buildings or Trump-branded buildings over the years were also bought by shell companies. So, meaning we don't know who the real owners were. So it's been a very, very common practice. I mean, the real estate market over the last 20 years in particular has been one that has been very penetrated or used or manipulated by these anonymous companies, and the money, we don't know who really owns them, but it's thought to come from the autocratic world, Russia, China, Kazakhstan, and elsewhere. This system has been allowed to exist. It used to be rather small. I mean, the concept of offshore bank account has been around for a long time. It used to be pretty anodyne thing. It was a kind of convenience for some kinds of banking transactions. But over the last 20 years, I think especially over the last 10 years, it's really exploded. Something like 10% of the world's GDP might exist in this world, be kept in offshore bank accounts. And again, that's anonymous money that has been, some of it's drug money, narcotics money, crime money. Some of it is just money people are hiding from their ex-wife or they're hiding from taxes. Some of it is money that's been stolen in the autocratic world, and the autocrats want to hide it, take it out, put it somewhere safer so they can bequeath a London apartment or a education at the London School of Economics for their kids. So it exists almost alongside our world. And you are right that Western, democratic world, bankers, accountants, lawyers have been part of making that possible. And of course, our legal system makes it possible. And some of it is a lot closer to home than we think. We imagine a tax haven or, to be something that exists on some kind of Caribbean island, but actually there are products you can buy in Wyoming, in Delaware, in South Dakota, in a number of American states. You can buy anonymous trusts or set up anonymous companies that do almost the same thing. And so the system has been very much enabled by our laws and by our system, and we could end it. We could cut it off. We could, there have been some progress made actually over the last few years. The Biden administration was beginning the process of ending some of these practices. Congress, there are a couple members of the Senate who've been working pretty hard on ending it. But of course, there's a big pushback, and I'm afraid most of that is going to be rolled back now. Some of that's already started in the new administration. They are going the other way, and they're going to enable this kleptocratic world to grow and spread even further. And I should say there's another side effect, because there's an instinct that a lot of people have, because it's kind of complicated world. It's hard to understand. Oliver Bullock, actually, who you've interviewed, his book is called Moneyland, and it's one of the best and easiest to understand versions that explains it if you want to know more about it. But the problem is not just that complicated world of finance. The problem is that money often re-enters the political system. So when you have anonymous money, it can, if you're an autocrat in Russia and you one way or another entrust your money, or in Russia it's called using wallets. You make somebody else your wallet. you give them use of your money, then they have an anonymous account. You can then begin to do political funding and influence campaigns, and we know that happens. How much money gets into the U.S. electoral system, I don't know. I mean, we have plenty of domestic secret money anyway, so maybe it's not important. But certainly there is evidence of Russian and other money filtering through European politics, other international politics. I mean, once that money is out there, and it's owned and controlled and if effectively secret, then it can be used to manipulate politics in all kinds of different ways. I mean, I would say that secrecy and the lack of transparency is a genuine feature of the autocratic world, and of course it exists in the democratic world too. But it's where it's a very negative influence. I mean, one of the things I think I want to emphasize, in this conversation we were having before about what's an autocracy, I mean, the battle between autocracy and democracy isn't just geographic. It's not just between us and China, or whatever, Iran and Germany. It's a battle that takes place inside every country, the battle between autocratic practices and democratic practices. And it's happening right now in the United States in a pretty vocal and clear way. But it's also happening in many European countries. There's a, as I said, the battle of ideas isn't just international, it's also domestic.
I actually set up a shell company a few years ago just to see if it was hard. It's not hard. And you don't have to, I know people say, well, you're a lawyer, you know how to do that stuff. Honestly, you could figure it out in a few hours. It's really easy, real easy. And if you can't do it because you can't read English, you can hire a lawyer and they can do it in a Saturday afternoon. I mean, it's so ridiculously simple. Movies would have you think that it's this complicated system that you need half of Deutsche Bank's analyst department, working on it. No, you can do it online. I mean, it's just so damn easy. The hardest part is finding a place to headquarter it. But once you do a few hours of research, I mean, you can do it in Delaware. You can do it, I think, in Nevada, or like you said, was it North Dakota? Yep. There's all these different places you can do it that you kind of wouldn't expect. You think, like, I can't do it in the U.S. Actually, we're kind of in HQ for a lot of those. It really is. By the way, you mentioned Oliver Bullough on the show, episode 228, for people who are looking for that and finding it or not finding it because it's pretty old. You mentioned in the book that Chinese censorship is, of course, on the rise, and the tech has evolved to the point where they're working on being able to predict political dissent based on internet activity. Can you give us an overview of how that would work? That's kind of incredible because you're talking about mind reading, essentially.
Yeah. So what the Chinese have is a system of monitoring the internet where, and there are a lot of people talk about the Great Firewall of China like it's a thing, but it's actually many different things. It's listening, on social media forums. It's control of social media forums. It's the banning of particular words. So the word Tiananmen is banned, and the Chinese have ways around it. I mean, they look for substitute words, that everybody knows means Tiananmen. When Tiananmen being, of course, the name of the protest in 1989 that was eventually shot down. There's even a funny story about people started, instead of referring to Xi Jinping, the leader of China, directly, somebody decided that he looked like Winnie the Pooh, and so they would talk about Winnie the Pooh, and then eventually that got banned because you could tell people were talking about Winnie the Pooh, and really they were talking about Xi Jinping. So the Chinese are always finding ways around this, but the state spends a lot of time censoring, monitoring. They don't cut everything because they want to know what people think. Actually, they're interested in knowing this, but they've also begun to be able to attach that online surveillance to real world surveillance. So street cameras, being able to monitor transportation that people use. So they can, if they're looking at a person or a group of people, that they can track them across time, through different places. Where are they going? Who did they meet? How much money do they spend? What do they, what kinds of things are they buying? The place in China where this has become most extreme and where they seem to be experimenting the most with really trying to understand what people are doing is Xinjiang. This is where the Uyghur population lives. This is a Muslim minority in China that's very heavily repressed. And there is There is DNA testing they do of people so that they can. That's another way in which they keep track of people. They keep track of people's electricity usage, because if someone has high use of electricity, then maybe someone is secretly staying in their house. So they begin to use all kinds of utilities, transport, credit cards, whatever information they have on people, they can unify it and they can examine what people are doing. And I do think it's pretty clear that the point over time is to understand, is to look for political dissent before it happens. So if they find a group of people who seem to be having intense conversations and are using a lot of electricity and are meeting offline somewhere, and you can trace their, then maybe you've identified a political cell or a meeting. And the same thing online. You can find, you can trace the development of ideas. And of course, once you have AI, a lot of this becomes much easier. You can trace how ideas spread, who's using them, who are the nodes of transport, who are the influencers that people are listening to in terms of politics. And of course, a lot of those capabilities we also have in theory. I mean, the tech world has them. The U.S. tech companies have them in theory. I mean, they haven't necessarily been used in practice, but one of the fears that Americans should have is that eventually they could. If they worked sufficiently together with the government or they collaborated, that it's not impossible to imagine how you could do that. So, and the other point about the Chinese surveillance systems is that they are selling those systems. They sell them to other dictatorships. Apparently nobody else has managed to use them with the sophistication that the Chinese have. But I don't know, if you're the government of Zimbabwe, maybe you'd like the capability to follow people around in Harare and know where they are at any given moment. The systems of street cameras have been purchased by a lot of countries, sometimes with benign intent. If you have street cameras, you prevent crime. And the UK has a lot of street cameras. So it's not necessarily to be used, for political tracking, but it could be. With the wrong kind of government or a lot of ill will. So I think, although this is so often talked about as these are Chinese capabilities, I think it's important to remember that once the technology exists, it could be used by others.
Yeah, I saw a video on Instagram a couple of days ago. My wife sent it to me and she's like, look how cool this is. And it was the cops finding somebody who had robbed some institution, and it's like him driving and then another camera of him driving and then him driving this way and that way and this way and that way and then getting out of the car, and then it just keeps switching cameras, but all the comments are like, oh my gosh, this is terrifying, this should be scary, this is not cool, this is scary. So you do think, wow, it's great they can catch this guy because he's a dangerous armed robber. But on the other hand, if you have a government that's willing to misuse this technology, now you can't get away. Yeah,
what if he wasn't a dangerous armed robber?
Right.
What if he was a political dissident? Or what if he was, somebody who someone in Washington wanted to get back at or wanted revenge for, against. Then you begin to, then you're already in quite a different world.
It's like that Will Smith movie from the early '90s, Enemy of the State. You ever see that?
It was many times.
Not a standout movie, but it was. I remember being like, "Wow, they turned his credit cards off. This is the future."
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. It's funny. I haven't seen it in a while, but I imagine the technology now will seem incredibly primitive and
right. Yeah, it'll be like, oh, we have him on camera at a shopping mall.
Right.
How are you viewing this camera from this far away? This is amazing. Yes, it uses satellites. Oh wow.
That's right. There were tags in his shoes or something, or in his coat, maybe. That's right. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. This is a long time before you could literally just buy an AirTag for $30 and throw it in your kid's shoes so that they don't wander off at the mall.
Right.
What's up with the falling out of windows in Russia? It's a cliche now. It's a joke now. Surely this is now being done deliberately, because otherwise, geez, hit someone with a car. Switch it up a little bit. They're not trying to make it look like an accident, right? They're trying to say, we killed this person. We just didn't use a bullet to do it because, I don't know, it's more poetic. I don't really get it. What's going on with this?
No, this is these are political murders, and they want everyone to know they're political murders. So they don't, for whatever reason, for reasons of delicacy, they don't want to shoot them in the face, but they want other people to be afraid. So actually for a long time in Putin's Russia, there weren't a lot of political murders. There wasn't that much political violence. Instead, there was kind of targeted violence. So they would pick on one journalist, or one activist, and that person would be bumped off. And the idea was that if you kill one person, if you kill Anna Politkovskaya, she was a famous journalist who was murdered, then you scare everybody else. So other journalists become afraid to do the kinds of things that she was doing. With the war in Ukraine, there is more opposition and there's more unrest, and especially this is all stuff that happens in the Russian elite. This isn't mostly doesn't happen to people in the provinces, and so there is a greater need to tighten up on internal dissent, and so it's been happening to bankers, to business people, to high-ranking bureaucrats. People who are inside the system will suddenly, as you say, fall out a window. There have been some falling down stairs as well, some even weirder ones, and a bunch of poisonings. And those are all of those things. It's not just to get rid of the person; it's also to scare the other people in their milieu, because they are afraid of internal dissent and people being anti-war.
That makes sense. The poisoning of, I think, is Alexander Litvinenko with the polonium-212. That was one of those where it's like, it has to be able to only have been us, right? So they get this weird substance that only exists, I don't know, inside a nuclear reactor that's in Siberia, and they use that to kill the guy. It's just like they wanted to...
that particular murder might have been an accident. I mean, it seems that the people who had the poison and were carrying it around London and leaving traces in hotel rooms and so on, they may not have known what it was. I mean, so that might have been stupidity. But you are right that very often they do things in a way that are designed to be followed. I mean, so for example, when Alexei Navalny was poisoned the second time, it was going to be clear that it was them. It was a poison that only the FSB had, and they want it to be known who's done it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so interesting because it's counterintuitive, right? The people online who are saying, "Oh, it's not the Russians." It's like, no, they want us to think this. You're no need to defend these people for free, especially. They want us to know who did this, that there's a reason they picked this particular method or this particular poison. I want to switch gears a little bit. How do we think communism would play out in the U.S.? And I know this is a crazy complicated question, so maybe some of these answers would be like a 30,000-foot overview, but what lessons can we draw from the history of communism in other nations, and how might they apply to a hypothetical scenario in the United States? Yeah, I suppose what I'm asking is, if communism were to emerge in the U.S., what would it look like in terms of governance, economy, and individual freedoms? And again, I realize that is a massive question, but...
it's also a little weird question because, I mean, what people in the U.S. think is communism. I mean, communism is, saying, I don't know, that there should be more banking regulation. I mean, that's kind of how the word communism now gets used in American discourse, especially online. I mean, it's a very stupid and superficial understanding of what the word was. I mean, so real, actual Soviet communism was something that was imposed with extreme violence. I mean, millions of people were murdered. It involved the state. The state took over all private property, all private business. So there were no private companies in the Soviet Union. There was no private land. There were no privately owned houses. It was a process that took several decades to achieve. It was the destruction of all, as I said, there was no independent business, no independent economy of any kind. In addition to that, there were no non-state organizations of any kind either. So and I wrote a book about this. So when the Soviet Union, for example, occupied Eastern Europe, when they came into Eastern Germany and they came into Poland and they came into Hungary at the end of the Second World War, one of the first things they did was take over like youth groups and clubs, so the chess club or the, or the soccer club or the hiking club, those were not allowed to be independent. So anything that we would call, what we would call an NGO or a charity or a civil society organization, all of those things were taken over by the state. So communism, in its harshest forms, later on, some of this broke down, especially in Eastern Europe. But the original idea was that the state owns everything. The state owns all the property, all the money, all the business, all the banks. But it also owns all the clubs, all the organizations, all the women's movement. There would be a formal, official women's movement. You weren't allowed to have your own private women's movement. You had to be, even if you were a feminist, you had to be part of that. It owned all of there were no independent charities. It also owned the entire educational system, so all of the universities, all of the schools, but also all the summer camps, all of the after-school clubs. So the idea was that the state there is only the state, and there's nothing outside the state. And this actually is Mussolini's definition of totalitarianism, which I may get a few words wrong, but it's something like everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. So the state owns everything. And that is what you would have to impose on the United States of America. And the amount of violence and angst and poverty you would have to use and create in order to get it is so enormous that I can't imagine it. So you're asking me to do something I can't imagine. I mean, as I said, that's what communism was. And they did do it. I mean, the Soviet Union did achieve that. Again, it was never complete. The idea was to, there were always bits and pieces that were left out and people who couldn't be controlled and so on. And they were even less successful doing it in Eastern Europe. But it was a totalitarian idea of society. And it has, again, nothing to do with the way the word communism gets used in modern America, for example, to describe me, or you probably,
Yeah, all the time. It's funny because I'll get a review that's like, this guy is nothing more than a right-wing fascist with a fashy haircut. And I'm like, okay, fine, guilty on the haircut, but the other stuff I don't really get. And then the next review is like, this left-wing commie, idiot, tanky. And I'm just like, guys, make up your mind.
Yeah,
Am
I had
a
that
communist
problem
or a fascist? Come on already.
Yep, I got that same problem.
It's almost like you have to average the two, and I end up in the middle. You've written extensively on the failures of communism. Why do you think the appeal persists in certain circles, especially in the West? This always baffles me.
The appeal. So there was something appealing to people who want simple answers, and also I think, let's be fair, okay. There are injustices in capitalism. There are huge gaps between the rich and the poor. There are people who don't have equal opportunities because of where and how they were born and the kinds of families they grew up in. And injustice is always something that rankles people and bothers them. And the idea that there could be a perfectly just state in which everyone has the same rights and in which there aren't very rich people, and very poor people, I think is theoretically appealing. Okay, I've spent a lot of my life reading about people who were communists, and many of them were in very bad faith. They were just people who wanted power, or they were sadists. But there were some people who, in good faith, believed that you could create. There were, if you designed it from the beginning, rather than just accepting the ebb and flow of history that wound up with, that created capitalism and some companies. And, instead of just accepting that, you could start from scratch, you could design a system and you could make it fair. And I think that had a deep appeal to a lot of people. I mean, of course, again, the problem was that in practice, imposing a system on people, imposing an economic system, and imposing a political system was a disaster from the beginning. I mean, there isn't actually an example of any state that seriously tried it that succeeded, and they failed from the beginning. I mean, the Soviet Union's the 1920s were a disaster. The 1930s were a bloodbath. In the 1940s, World War II basically saved Stalin. It rescued. Because they won the war, partly thanks to the help of the United States, they were able to somehow rescue the idea of communism for a bit longer. But I mean, it never, one of the reasons they kept having these cycles of violence, and this is true in Eastern Europe as well, was because they never were able to do what they said they were going to do. They kept saying, this is the perfect system. We're going to have, prosperity for everybody. We're going to defeat the United States in the sense of we're going to have a better system than them. And it never happened. And because it never happened, they kept having to look for scapegoats. So why are we all still poor? Why are we poorer now than we were in Tsarist Russia? Why is the system failing? And so, well, the answer is that there are saboteurs and there are traitors and there are Trotskyites who are trying to undermine us, and therefore we need to find them and arrest them and put them in the gulag. And that was, and that cycle happened, repeatedly. And then there would be a thaw and they would let people out because that wasn't working. And then there would be another wave of arrests. And that happens in every one of these countries because the ideal that they had could never be reached. And also communism was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature, what makes people work hard, the ideas of ambition. Once you eliminate ownership, for example, nobody can own their own house. Okay, well, if you don't own your house, then why should you keep it up? Why should you paint it? If somebody else owns it, why should you invest in it? And the same was true of a company. If you're working for a company and you're not going to ever make any more money, and your time isn't going to produce anything good for you, then maybe you only pretend to work. Maybe you don't really work. And one of the things the communist system was always doing was inventing incentives. Okay, so people don't really want to work, so let's have a worker competition, and let's have posters on the wall, and whoever digs the most coal gets a prize, because they couldn't motivate people in any other way. And so they created these fake motivational systems. I mean, it was fundamentally incompatible with human nature. And as I said, from day one, it began with violence. It needed violence to maintain itself all the way through. And eventually it collapsed because the people who were running it, even they didn't believe in it. And that became clear by the 1980s.
A lot of people, I see a lot of hyperbole online, like America is headed towards dictatorship or something like that. And I know you've expressed concerns about the erosion of democratic norms in the U.S. Do you see trends that might be leading toward authoritarianism in the United States?
Let me begin by saying that authoritarianism always begins with behavioral changes, with people starting to change their attitudes. And that you can already see in the U.S. A few examples. If you were an election worker in Arizona in 2020 and you declared that you believed that Donald Trump had lost the election, you were then subject to, and I've interviewed people who had this experience, so this is not theoretical. You were then subject to a barrage of online hate and personal threats that were designed to intimidate you and make you afraid to do your job. We now live in I'm just beginning with the cultural changes. We now live in a culture where the expression of political views can result in you can live in an atmosphere of fear and terror if you simply express ideas. This is the beginning of a cultural change. That's number one. We also have, really for the first time in American history, we have an American president who talks about some Americans as if they weren't Americans. They're not legitimate. During his election campaign, Donald Trump referred to his enemies as vermin. He used the expression, immigrants will poison the blood of the nation. So these are, this is language that you can't find previously in American politics. In other words, he's saying only people who vote for me are real Americans. My enemies are vermin, poison, insects, or sometimes Marxists, as we were just discussing. So you're beginning to have a polarization in America that's not normal politics. It's actually this you do have on both sides. You have people seeing one another as non-citizens, as illegitimate, or as people who who don't deserve to be part of a political community. And that's just that's before we get to the current state of affairs. Over the last few weeks, we've also seen something that I've seen before in other countries. As I said, I lived in Poland. I saw this happen when an autocratic populist government took over there. It's actually now out of power, but we did have it for several years. I saw it happen in Hungary, which is a country that I spent a lot of time in at one point. One of my books is partly about Hungary. I saw a version of it in Russia 20 years earlier as well. And this is an attempt by one political party or grouping to capture the state. So in theory, in a democracy, when you win an election, you have the right to be president or be in Congress, for 4 years. But meanwhile, you preserve all the institutions of the state. And then when the 4 years are over, if you lose your election, you hand them back over to the other political party. In countries where democracy is declining or where it's under attack, you have elected leaders who instead seek to take over the state and use it for, instead of having neutral civil servants who know about air pollution or how to run an airport, you seek to put loyalists who are loyal specifically to you as a person or sometimes to your political party. You seek to have judges who aren't neutral judges who adhere to the rule of law, whether they're conservative or liberal. Instead, you have judges who will specifically make exceptions for you. They'll be loyal to you. In other words, you have rule by law instead of rule of law. You seek to have media which doesn't even attempt to be neutral. Instead, you want media that's, again, loyal to you and is afraid to criticize you. And in the weeks since Donald Trump took office, you've seen multiple attempts now to frighten civil servants in order to produce a new level, a different kind of loyalty. You've seen even before the inauguration, you saw attempts to persuade or pressure media to pay homage or fealty to him or to be afraid to criticize him. So you're already beginning to see, so we're working on the base that existed before. So we already had a very polarized culture. We already had some people who were afraid to be politically active or to use, to express ideas. You already had that in place. Now we're watching one political party led by Trump, but also empowered by Elon Musk, seek to capture the state. I mean, to me, the most sinister piece of it is Musk's attempt to capture the databases and computer systems of many departments of government. We don't really fully know yet why he's doing that. He may be doing it to in order, he might have private reasons for it. I mean, he's somebody who has many billions of dollars of government contracts. Maybe he could use this information to increase his own wealth. Maybe he has other goals. I don't know. We've never before had somebody without any clear government role, without any confirmation by Congress, having that kind of access to the system, payment systems and databases and other systems of the U.S. government. The abolition of USAID, whatever you think of USAID, this is the aid agency that has been in existence since the 1970s. Whatever you think of it, it doesn't matter. The destruction of that agency, which existed because of Congress, which was a Congress, was passed by American laws, which had a budget that was approved by a series of congressional leaders, was a demonstration of executive power. I mean, what Musk and Trump are saying to everybody who works in the federal government is we can destroy you, we can eliminate you, and then we can run a smear campaign on Twitter that cherry picks information that we've obtained about you in order to make people think you're bad. And that's what's just happened. So all these are the actions of, when we have seen in other countries, when we have seen illiberal leaders take over and seek to damage a democracy. And by the way, this is something that can happen on the left as well as there is. This is more or less what Hugo Chavez did in Venezuela, as well as what Viktor Orban did in Hungary. When you see those kinds of actions, your democracy is in trouble.
Yeah, that seems like these things could lead to a tipping point that could lead us to authoritarianism, dictatorship, whatever you want to call it. This is probably a dumb question and oversimplified, but how long does that take? How long does it take to go, wait a minute, our government is this is not a democracy anymore? Like in history, how does it work with other countries, or how has it worked with other countries where you're just a dictatorship now? How does that happen?
That takes a long time. You'll be glad to know.
Yes, I am.
No,
I'm glad to know.
Usually it takes a long time. So in Poland, we had a sort of would-be autocratic populist political party in power. They had 8 years in power, and they didn't complete control, and so they lost an election eventually. Even though it was an unfair election, even though they'd captured part of the legal system and the courts, even though they had taken over state media and so on, nevertheless, it was still possible to defeat them. In Venezuela, you've now had many years. It took a long time for Chavez to. Chavez was very popular when he was first elected, and when he was legitimately elected, democratically elected leader. He was very popular. He appealed to the poor. He did a lot of things, especially at the moment when oil prices were high, when he could give away a lot of money and other things to poor Venezuelans. And so even as he was destroying the independent institutions of the state, even as he was wrecking the civil service, even as he was, for example, Venezuela had a state oil industry. He fired, I think it's like 19 or 20,000 people from it and replaced them with loyalists. And and then that was the beginning of the end of their oil industry. Even as all that was happening, I've seen some statistics that say even kind of 10 years into that process, many Venezuelans still believed they lived in a democracy, even as the institutions of their democracy were dying. And it really only became crystal clear when people understood that it was impossible to elect anyone else. And we've had several attempts of the Venezuelan opposition to elect someone else, including a recent one last fall that in which the opposition won and nevertheless were not allowed to take power. And now it's clear that Venezuela is a dictatorship, but that took well over a decade, 20 years. But the main point is that very often as this is happening, there are many people who voted for Trump and were not voting for authoritarianism or autocracy or anything like that. In fact, I would say most people didn't think that's what they were voting for. So I'm not saying that happened. But he will do things that they will like, that many people will like. Maybe he's done some already. He abolished transgenderism. Essentially, that's what a lot of people wanted. And so as he does things that people will like, they'll, the decline of the institutions won't bother them until at a later stage when we see the impact. So, as you begin to lose your independent civil service, your government declines, and the capacity of the government to do things gets worse. This I saw in Poland. That you have once the civil service is selected for loyalty to the leader and not because they know how to identify and stop water pollution, then you begin to have a lot of water pollution. So there begin to be the state begins to decline, and that can take a long time. So there will be many moments when a decline can be stopped. I think we're entering a period in which there are going to be a lot of lawsuits. Seeking to stop Musk from illegally and breaking into government databases, or illegally end agencies that have been, that exist thanks to Congress. There will be a lot of lawsuits, and a key moment to watch for is what happens when the opponents of Musk win the lawsuits. Then what happens? Does the administration accept the verdict of the courts, or do they try to defy it? That will be actually that will be a key moment. There will be there'll be many moments, that you'll see. It's also possible that, chaos takes over, things become murkier. It turns out to be a lot harder to take over the Department of Justice than they thought. I mean, there are a lot of things that could happen between now and even 6 months from now. But it is something that all Americans should pay attention to. I mean, let's go back to the very beginning of this conversation. What is an autocracy? An autocracy is a state where there are no checks and balances, where the executive there's no parliament, there's no Congress to compete for power, where the media is controlled, where the courts are politicized, where there's a lot of secrecy, where there's no transparency, where there's no accountability for people in power. And, as you see the Trump administration heading in that direction, if that's indeed what it continues to do, then you should recognize those things as warning signs. It doesn't mean we're going to be Russia, next week. It doesn't mean, that you won't have, the Bill of Rights won't continue to exist and you won't have freedom of speech. But the decline of the institutions of the state and of the government will have, sooner or later, will have effects on people's prosperity, on their way of life, and on the kinds of governments that we could have in the future. So I would take it very seriously.
I know I've taken a lot of your time. In closing, maybe this will end up on a positive note. We'll see. What steps can citizens and leaders take to reinforce democratic resilience in the face of these challenges?
Be engaged. Join your local political party. Pay attention to the most basic, the most local elections wherever you live, in whatever city or county or state. Remember that democracy is a gift. That you inherited it from the people who invented it in generations past. People who live in Russia, people who live in Venezuela envy you, because you get to choose who your county commissioner is. And so take that responsibility seriously. And, it doesn't mean you have to, it's not even only about politics, be in your neighborhood association, be part of your community, be engaged in local life at whatever level you can be. It's really, democracies succeed when they are based on active citizens. Active citizens have to be involved. And also, by the way, the more active you are and the more different kinds of people you meet, the less polarized we are. When you're meeting people who disagree with you on a daily basis, when you're able to talk to them in a reasonable way, when you're all talking about real issues like where to build the bridge or which road to repair first, then you're not off in the world of mythology and celebrity politics that the extremists want you to be in. I mean, remember, we also talked about mythology and the power of the online world and how it can sometimes be more powerful than the real world. Try to live in the real world and base your politics on what you see, not on some threat that's been described to you on TV, but actually look at your neighbors, look at your neighborhood, look how you live. Try to fix those things and live in the real world as much as you can.
Anne Applebaum, thank you so much. This is fascinating, and I really appreciate you humoring all my probably relatively silly questions about elementary topics.
Thank you. No, there are no silly questions. Only silly answers, I guess.
Thank you for checking out this entire episode on YouTube. If you want to follow up on this topic, check out our podcast feed or visit us on our website at jordanharbinger.com, where you can learn more about our guest and dive even deeper into what we discussed today. And remember, YouTube only has about a quarter of the episodes that we release here on the Jordan Harbinger Show audio feed. Any podcast app should have us. Check out the links in the description where you'll find access to all of our shows that don't appear on YouTube, such as Skeptical Sunday, where we debunk topics like crystal healing, GMOs, conspiracy theories, homeopathy, tipping, and even lawns to find out if they're backed by science and or logic. Also, our Feedback Friday episodes where we help people escape from cults, get raises at work, and take all manner of questions from you, the audience, and some of that stuff is dicey. Every episode of The Jordan Harbinger Show has something useful that you can take away and apply in your own life and help you navigate what I know can often seem like the overwhelming and paralyzing challenges of modern life. Thank you for watching, and remember to like, comment, and subscribe.